Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is pretty simple. We take a whole bunch of sources that you give us, and we pull out the most valuable stuff, the key insights, the surprising bits, basically everything you need to get up to speed quickly, but, properly.
Yeah, think of us as your guides. We wade through all the information, find the essentials, and help you see that bigger picture without drowning in every single detail.
So today we're diving deep into the world of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it's a really personal dive because our sources aren't like standard biographies.
Yeah.
We've got this amazing collection of his letters, plus some related notes, mostly covering the years 1804 to 1834.
That's a big chunk of his adult life, roughly 30 years.
Mm.
It covers his time in Malta right through to his later years living in Highgate. And these letters, to the people closest to him, you got Thomas Poole, William and Dorothy Wordsworth, Robert Southey, Charles Lamb, his wife Sarah.
And others too, right? Like Daniel Stewart, J.J. Morgan, James Gilman.
Exactly. People he really confided in.
So this is Coleridge kind of unfiltered, writing to people he trusted. You get these raw, immediate glimpses into what he was really thinking, his struggles, which were immense, how his creative process actually worked, the messy parts and all those complicated relationships he had.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal here is to sift through these private words, these letters, to really try and understand the man himself, the human being behind the famous poet and philosopher, to see the world as much as we can through his eyes as he was experiencing it. Okay, so where do we start? Let's unpack this.
Well, I think the first thing that just hits you when you read these letters, page after page, really, is Coleridge's constant battle with his health, both physical and mental.
Yeah, it's not just like he got sick sometimes. It feels more like a fundamental part of his existence during these years, doesn't it? He writes about needing just enough strength enough to smile gratefully at his nurses, or feeling wretchedly ill even when his mind was, buzzing.
Absolutely. And he lists specific things, often with this sort of weary resignation. There's a persistent teasing cough. He talks about his pulse fluctuating wildly, heart palpitations, and this really striking phrase he uses, a dreadful falling abroad, as it were, of my whole frame.
Wow. That sounds like more than just feeling unwell. It's like falling apart.
It really does. It felt like disintegration to him, I think. And you see him constantly searching for relief. He pins his hopes on travel, like maybe a year in Madeira might sort him out.
Which was common then, wasn't it? For health?
Yeah, very common. Or seeking help from well-known doctors like Dr. Abernethy.
And this leads to something really significant that comes through in the letters, doesn't it? His move to live with James Gilman.
Oh, absolutely pivotal. Around 1816, he goes to live with Gilman, who is a surgeon, in Highgate. And this wasn't just crashing on a sofa for a few weeks. It was a deliberate, long-term thing, specifically set up to help him deal with his huge struggles and, critically, his dependence on opium.
Right. And he stayed there for how long?
For the rest of his life, 18 years.
18 years. Wow. And the letters from that time, and even before, they're incredibly frank about the addiction, aren't they?
Startlingly so.
Mm.
He insists it wasn't about pleasure for him. He talks about a dreadful physical necessity. He describes this awful cycle where, trying to abstain might lift his spirits for a bit, but then the physical withdrawal symptoms would come back with a vengeance and just drive him back to it.
That sounds hellish.
It does. And there's this really profound sense of self-blame that comes out of it, almost theological. He calls the illness and addiction a sin against an infinite, imperishable being. He even writes about feeling he's had more than a glimpse of what is meant by death and outer darkness and the worm that dieth not.
Good grief. So it wasn't just a physical problem for him, it was deeply moral, spiritual.
Exactly. A whole crisis of being. And later on, you see him reflecting on this, even thinking about maybe setting up a house of health for what he calls will maniacs or impotents.
Which sounds like he's talking about himself, doesn't it? That struggle of the will against the body.
It feels very much like it. That sense of the mind being active, wanting to do things, but the will being somehow broken or overwhelmed by the body's demands. He had this image of his body as a turbid shrine.
A turbid shrine?
Yeah, like a clouded, impure vessel that was struggling to contain the light of life, the intellectual and spiritual energy inside him. This split body versus mind, it's just a constant thread.
Okay, so moving from that internal battle, the physical stuff, to his actual work. These letters give us an incredible window into just how much he was trying to do, the sheer variety of it all, but also the constant effort and, frankly, frustration involved.
Yeah, he wasn't just the Kubla Khan guy, was he? The letters show him working on poetry, sure, but also philosophy, essays, drama, journalism. He was giving lectures. His ambitions were huge, but the reality was often pretty tough.
With poetry, his admiration for Wordsworth really comes through, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. He calls Wordsworth's big poem, The Recluse, the first and finest philosophical poem ever. He even says something like, he feels he's a better poet himself just by being able to appreciate Wordsworth's genius properly.
That's quite a statement. But his own big prose projects, like The Friend, caused him a lot of grief.
Oh, yeah. The Friend was meant to be this series of essays, but it sounds like a logistical nightmare. He writes about problems with the stamp office, which was like the tax authority for publications.
Right.
And even worse, subscribers just not paying up.
Mm-hmm.
Which you can imagine caused him huge embarrassment and torment. He uses those exact words.
Ouch. But he kept going, didn't he? Despite the setbacks, the letters mention other big works getting published.
Yeah, definitely. Biographia Literaria, Sibylline Leaves, those key works appear. And you see him working on critical stuff too, like essays on what he called genial criticism, applying ideas to fine arts. He published those in a Bristol newspaper.
And wasn't that partly to help out a friend?
That's right. He mentions it was partly to help his friend, the American painter Washington Allston, get his pictures exhibited. So there's that practical side too.
He seemed to see all his writing, whether it was art criticism or politics, as applying these sort of fundamental principles about human nature to whatever the subject was.
Exactly. And he makes this really striking claim. It's almost boastful, but then immediately undercut with sadness. He says his output of thoughts, images, words, and erudition was published in larger quantities than almost anyone else in England. But then he adds, though not by or for myself.
Ooh, that hits hard. What about his plays? That seems like a different world altogether.
It was, and a bit of a mixed bag for him. His play Remorse actually had a very successful opening night, unexampled applause, he calls it. That must have felt amazing.
You'd think so.
But almost immediately in his letters, he's expressing doubts about whether it will last. He's worried they don't have the right actor for a main part, or Donio, and he thinks the play doesn't have enough vulgar pathos.
Vulgar pathos, like basic emotional stuff for the masses.
Kind of, yeah. Stuff to really grab the ordinary theater goer and keep him coming back. But, interestingly, he does acknowledge the financial side. He apparently made more money from Remorse than from all his other literary work put together, even after accounting for losses on earlier ventures, like The Watchman and The Friend.
Wow. So it was a commercial success, even if he had artistic doubts. Did he mention critiques?
He does. He mentions a man of great talents. Doesn't say who pointed out some unequal lines in the verse.
And that character, Ordonio, going from pride to distraction, you can almost see Coleridge himself in that, can't you? That introspective depth.
Definitely. His other play mentioned these letters, Zapoya, didn't do so well. It got rejected by the Drury Lane Committee, eventually just published as a book. And he sounds pretty frustrated dealing with the theater management. He specifically mentions one difficult experience with a managership of noblemen.
Right. Lectures were another thing he did, weren't they?
Yes, several series. At the Royal Institution, lectures on the history of philosophy, on the arts. He sometimes sounds a bit self-deprecating about it, like he felt it could be a bit histrionic, or like being a retail dealer in instruction and pastime.
Huh. A retail dealer.
Yeah, but he does note that they were generally well received.
Yeah.
People approved.
Did he have other big projects bubbling away?
Well, he mentions thinking about translating Goethe's Faust. He knew it would be incredibly demanding, a huge undertaking.
Which it absolutely would be. So underlying all this creative activity, there are these constant practical problems. Money, publishers.
Oh, constantly. Financial worries are everywhere. The drain from The Watchman and The Friend, disputes with publishers he names Fenner and Curtis, and that recurring nightmare of subscribers just not paying. The letters really paint a picture of someone often feeling completely overwhelmed by money troubles linked directly to his writing.
And how did he feel about critics and sort of public taste generally?
He could be pretty fiery about criticism. He absolutely explodes about what he calls the infamous Edinburgh Review of Wordsworth's Excursion, and another piece on Lord Nelson in the same journal. He saw them as just malicious, slanderous, totally hypocritical.
So he took reviews very personally, especially when they attacked friends.
Very much so. And he had this view that the public often went for what he called the accidentally agreeable, something easy, maybe flashy, instead of appreciating the truly good and the beautiful. He uses Shakespeare's Othello versus some popular melodrama of the time, Castle Spectre as an example. The shallow stuff often wins out, basically.
Yeah, that sounds familiar even today. Okay, so let's step outside his study for a bit. These letters also cover his travels, right? And his views on the wider world, society, politics.
They really do. You get these fantastic little snapshots from his journeys. We already mentioned Madeira, but he talks about plans for Sicily, wanting to see Syracuse, Catania near Mount Etna, hoping to stay with the British consul there, Mr. Lecky. He even asks for a letter from Lord Nelson to help him with some local Benedictines.
Wow, so he was really planning these trips in detail. And he traveled within Britain, too.
Oh, yes. Liverpool, London, other places. And you get these vivid descriptions, things he saw from the ship, like Cape Mondego or the Rock of Lisbon, the mountains near Sintra in Portugal. His description of Valletta in Malta is great. A town of all nations and all languages, he says, talking about the steep streets with stairs, the tall houses built around central courtyards.
It sounds quite exotic compared to England. Did he enjoy the travel itself?
He certainly observes keenly, but he also notes the downsides, like the sheer inconvenience of convoy sailing during wartime, having to constantly lie by and wait for the laggards, and the risk of ships bumping into each other, especially in narrow seas.
Right, practicalities. And his time in Malta was quite significant, wasn't it? He had an official job there.
Yes, from 1804 to 1806, he was the public secretary, basically the #2 civilian official under the governor, Sir Alexander Ball, who he says was exceedingly kind to him. It sounds like a busy job, lots of signing documents, administering oaths.
Did he enjoy that kind of work?
It's hard to say definitively from the letters alone, but he does make a point of noting he only took half the salary. He says it was to avoid having the responsibilities of the treasurer role added on. So maybe he found the administrative burden quite heavy.
Makes sense. And how did he react to the different landscapes, the different people he met abroad?
He definitely drew contrasts with England. He talks about the familiar English countryside fields, houses, shared language and culture, and compares it unfavorably sometimes with what he saw near Gibraltar. He has some pretty harsh words for the Spaniards he saw, calls them a degraded race, and the Moors, wretches that dishonor human nature.
Ooh. Yeah, it definitely reflects the attitudes of the time, I suppose.
Absolutely. It's jarring to read now, but it's there in the letters. He also just notes the sheer foreignness of things, like the plants seeing prickly aloe for the first time.
And through his writing, he was engaging with the big political issues, too.
Very much so. He mentions writing formal papers, memorials about places like Egypt, Sicily, the African coast, specifically warning about French ambitions in those areas. His essays covered huge topics comparing the French Empire to the Roman, speculating about the Bourbons returning to power in France, the situation in Ireland, Catholic emancipation.
Were all these published?
Not all of them. He mentioned some didn't get published, sometimes because the editor of the paper he was writing for, Mr. Street at the Courier, wasn't keen on the topic, like with Catholic emancipation.
So he was writing for newspapers like The Courier.
Yes, political essays, edited by Daniel Stewart initially. But he eventually stopped writing regularly for them. He says he realized it wasn't the independent paper he thought it was. He might have generally preferred the government ministers of the day, but he was strongly against giving indiscriminate support of any class of men. Principles matter more than party lines to him.
That sounds very Coleridge. What about other issues? Slavery?
Clear support for abolition. He really praises Thomas Clarkson's history of the abolition movement and actively pushes his contacts to get it favorably reviewed.
And does he mention specific politicians much?
Sometimes in passing, he might critique someone's writing style, like Colonel Wardle's, or make an observation like seeing Lord Erskine's efforts to legislate for animal welfare as sort of typical of the age.
Okay, so amidst all this, the health problems, the intense creative work, navigating the wider world, what about the people closest to him? Family, friends. These letters must be full of that.
Absolutely central. You really feel that these relationships were often the anchors holding him together through all the turbulence.
His children, for instance.
Oh, his love for Hartley, Derwent, and Sarah just beams out of the letters. He's clearly proud of them, mentions little Sarah speaking French and Italian fluently. But he worries too, especially about Hartley's habits of idleness. He cares deeply about their education and well-being.
And his wife, Sarah. Their relationship seems complicated in biographies. What do the letters show?
Complex is the right word. There's clearly distant separation for long periods. But he consistently refers to her with respect as the excellent mother of my children, someone who is always more than the word friend can express when applied to a woman. He acknowledges deep past pain, talks about moments that cost him tears of blood, but always maintains his esteem and honor for her.
And then there's the Wordsworths, William and Dorothy. That friendship seems so crucial.
Crucial, and ultimately tragic. His admiration for William's poetry, as we said, was immense, divine, sublimer poet. The letters show how close they were, practically to Mary and Dorothy copying out William's poems so Coleridge could take them with him to Sicily.
And you get glimpses of just ordinary friendship, too.
Yeah, lovely little moments like an anecdote where Coleridge, William, and Dorothy are all made cheerful just because their friend Thomas Poole came to visit. It reminds you of the simple good times they must have shared.
But then, the quarrel. These letters must show the impact of that.
Oh, painfully so, in raw detail. It all started, according to Coleridge, when Wordsworth apparently said some very harsh things about him to a mutual acquaintance. Basil Montague calling Coleridge a nuisance in the Wordsworth household, saying he had no hope of me. And Montague, maybe foolishly, maybe maliciously, repeated this directly to Coleridge.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and you read Coleridge's letters from that time, and the sheer anguish, the feeling of betrayal, is just overwhelming. He tries to explain himself, defend his actions, but the real wound is feeling so utterly dismissed and, well, trashed by someone he loved and admired so profoundly. He struggles to control himself, uses words like cruel and base about Wordsworth's reported comments while he's agitated.
That must have been devastating, losing a friendship that deep.
15 years of intense connection, he says. Its loss clearly left a massive hole in his life.
Who else was really important? Robert Southey. They were related too, weren't they?
Yes. Southey married Sarah Coleridge's sister, Edith. So they were brothers-in-law as well as friends. Coleridge's letters talk about Southey's work Medoc, Thalaba, his reviews for journals, his finances, his character. It's quite a candid view. He admires Southey's incredible industry and integrity, calls him honorable and honest, but he also doesn't shy away from critiquing Southey's reviews sometimes or expressing reservations about a big work like Medoc. So, an honest friendship, warts and all. What about Thomas Poole? He seems to pop up a lot. Poole was bedrock, a constant, lifelong friend. Coleridge leans on him hugely, especially when he's ill or trying to get sober. He writes about just being with Poole, remembering their younger days together in Quantock and Alfoxden, talking over plans like his Royal Institution lectures. He calls Poole the friend of my inmost soul.
That's powerful. Charles Lamb is another famous connection.
Yes, Lamb. Their friendship had its strains, sometimes involving other people like Charles Lloyd, but it endured. Coleridge writes to Lamb about the Wordsworth quarrel, clearly needing to share that pain.
And there were others who helped him practically, especially when he was unwell.
Definitely. The Morgans, J.J. and Mrs. Morgan, took him in, first in Hammersmith, then in Kellen, during a really rough patch before he went to the Gilmans. He describes their faithful devotion and explicitly calls them his saviors.
His saviors. Strong words.
Very. And then, of course, James and Mrs. Gilman in Highgate, providing not just medical supervision, but a stable home for those last 18 years. He acknowledges their noble motives in taking him in. Mrs. Gilman's faith and consistent care seem to have been particularly important to him.
So a real network of support, even amidst the difficulties.
Yes, and others too. Daniel Seward, the editor. J.H. Green, a surgeon who became a close friend and philosophical disciple, discussing Kant and Schelling with him. A younger man, Thomas Alsop, who came into his circle via the lectures. John Hookham Frere, who he deeply admired as an ideal Christian gentleman. Even his attendant towards the end, Harriet Macklin, he specifically asked his family on his deathbed to acknowledge her care.
It shows how much those connections mattered. Okay, finally, let's dive into his inner world. Beyond the specific works, what do these letters tell us about his philosophy, his religion, his self-reflection?
This is where you really see the engine room of his mind, I think. It's incredibly rich and always restless. You see him wrestling with these big philosophical ideas, like that famous distinction he made between imagination and fancy.
Right, imagination being the really creative, unifying power.
Exactly. The aggregating power, he calls it, even a dim analog of creation. While fancy is more just, rearranging existing bits, he also digs into how the mind perceives the world, its sensuous language. He builds on Bishop Berkeley, but goes further, arguing the senses aren't just passive receivers, they're living growths of the mind or your spirit itself.
So the mind shapes reality more actively.
That's the idea, and he sketches out this grand plan for his whole philosophical system, starting with the Propolium on the power and use of words, comprising logic, basically, understanding language and thought, which would then lead into the huge topics, God, nature, and man.
Ambitious stuff. What about his religious faith?
Deeply felt, absolutely central, but also full of struggle. You see him thinking about how people move from sort of natural religion to revealed religion. He definitely valued critical thinking about faith. He wasn't into blind acceptance. At one point, he expresses some sympathy for Quakers and Unitarians, seeing them as perhaps the only Christians, but he also strongly defended the established church later on.
And his view of himself in relation to God.
Intense self-scrutiny, almost overwhelmingly harsh sometimes. He calls himself the vilest of sinners when he compares himself to God's perfection. But alongside that, there's this belief that knowledge is most valuable when it's truly understood and lived out, when it's applied.
And that comes through towards the end.
Very powerfully. There's a note about his solemn deathbed words to his godchild, urging the child to seek God early, trust in his promises, talking about finding the peace that passeth all understanding. It feels like a culmination of that lifelong wrestling with faith.
How did he view other philosophers? Kant, for instance.
Huge reverence for Kant. Calls him the only philosopher for all men. But it wasn't uncritical reverence. He offers specific critiques, even about Kant's views on prayer, which he thought kind of undermined Kant's own system.
Interesting. What about others, like Schelling?
He saw Schelling as a man of great genius, definitely, but also ambitious and maybe not entirely intellectually honest or earnest, as he put it. He dismissed Jacobi as more of a rhapsodist, and he engages with specific scholars, too, like German biblical critics Eichhorn and Heinrichs, when discussing his own studies on the book of Daniel.
And his letters are full of those characteristic Coleridgeisms, right? Those striking images and ideas.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He coins the term theomammonists for people trying to serve both God and money, referencing bowing in the Temple of Rimmon, maybe aimed at someone like Humphrey Davy, the scientist. There's that brilliant image of spilled spillikins, the game like pick up sticks to describe a chaotic, rambling conversation.
Yeah.
Or the story of a motto for a market clock just suddenly popping into his head, fully formed.
And that image you mentioned earlier about his self-assessment.
Right, the simile of the bird with the shattered wing, broken, flawed, yet still trying to fly, still striving towards God. It just captures so much of that internal state, the struggle, the aspiration, the sense of damage that you find throughout these letters.
Yeah. So these explorations of philosophy, religion, himself, they add this incredible depth, don't they? It shows the mind behind the famous works was also just constantly grappling with the biggest questions of life, morality, and his own flawed nature.
Absolutely. It makes the intellectual achievement seem even more remarkable, knowing the internal context.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does it all mean? Diving into these incredibly personal letters, it feels like we get a picture of Coleridge that's so much richer, so much more human, and definitely more complex than any standard biography could really give you.
Yeah, you see the brilliant mind, the way they created these amazing poems and philosophical ideas, but you see it constantly battling just debilitating physical illness and the absolute horror of addiction. You see the celebrated writer dealing with, very real money problems and the sting of bad reviews.
And you see the man who clearly loved his friends and family so deeply, but also went through these incredibly painful, life-changing breaks in those relationships.
Exactly. These sources, they don't just tell us what he thought. They show us the messy, vital, often really painful day-to-day reality of being Samuel Taylor Coleridge, living, creating under just immense pressure, both internal and external.
And it's striking how modern some of it feels, isn't it? The struggles with health, with money tied to creative work, the complexities of relationships, they don't feel that distant. And the insights he gained from all that, insights into the mind, into will, faith, connection, they still feel really relevant today.
They really do resonate.
So, thinking about everything we've uncovered, what stands out most to you from this dive into his private world? Is it the depth of the pain he endured, the sheer resilience that kept him writing, the tangled web of his friendships and family ties?
It's hard to pick one thing. Maybe the sheer intensity of it all. But here's a thought, maybe where it gets really interesting. Given how incredibly open he seems in these letters, right? Pouring out his soul about his addiction, his finances, his broken heart.
Yeah.
What essential part of himself, if anything, might even he have been hiding? Maybe unconsciously. Or maybe something he just couldn't find the words for, even to himself, even in these private letters.
That is interesting. Something to definitely think about.